I would imagine that everyone in this room who's ever identified themselves as a socialist has been told at some point, get back to Russia. Or, you know, even been told in absolutely categorical terms, socialism can't work, look what happens in Russia. And to be honest, this is 20 years now since the fall of the Eastern European regimes, the fall of so-called communism in 1989. The ideological hold of what happened in both countries is massive. So that's now. Imagine what it was like for SWP members in the 60s, 70s and 80s, when those so-called socialist or communist countries actually existed. You needed an understanding of those regimes, because otherwise you could end up falling into two big dangers. One of them was trying to defend Russia and defend the crimes of Stalin, from the Gulag to forced labour to whatever. Or maybe just giving up on revolutionary Marxism entirely because it doesn't work, look at that. And the theory of state capitalism, as developed by Tony Cliff, who was one of the founding members of the International Socialists, what became the SWP, it enabled that group to explain why these regimes were not only not socialist, but not progressive either. People may know our slogan on Socialist Worker used to be, neither Washington nor Moscow, but international socialism. But let's step back further. Imagine you were Tony Cliff, or one of the small group of Trotskyists after the Second World War. It's only 30 years after 1917, after the Russian Revolution, when workers had taken power, giving us a glimpse of a different society. But in those 30 years, there'd been Nazi Germany, the Second World War. Actually, you were confronted with Stalinism. How would you make sense of that? Trotsky, who'd been whole meetings on Trotsky, leading political giant who'd led in the Russian Revolution, he'd led the fight against Stalinism. And in so doing, preserved the real tradition of what had happened in 1917 and the real revolutionary tradition. But after the Second World War, it was clear that he'd made a number of predictions that weren't actually true. They were wrong. Because although he'd led the fight against Stalin, Trotsky had said he'd still called Russia some sort of worker state. He'd called it a degenerated worker state. Somehow it was still more progressive. And he said it was very unstable and it wouldn't survive the war. It's clearly not true, because actually after the Second World War it was stronger. It had expanded into Hungary, Poland, other Eastern European countries. And he'd also said things like that Western capitalism was in terminal crisis. After the war, we entered the longest boom in capitalist history. So what do you do if you're calling yourself a Trotskyist but you're faced in this situation? Some people refuse to face the facts. Whatever's going on in the world, that's wrong, Trotsky must be right. Actually, some other people who were the forerunners of the International Socialists, they were clear. Marxism is not a dogma. It's not fixed and unchanging that we learn by heart. It's a way of understanding the world, and the world develops and changes. And so they had to face the facts. And as Tony Cliff says, when you read anything that he writes about this, wrestle with some very difficult questions. But by doing so, they were able to preserve the real spirit of Trotsky. And this course that we're now starting on the international social tradition is to look at some of the different questions that confronted people after the Second World War and look at how Marxism developed and keep that tradition alive. Now, what got Tony Cliff thinking after the Second World War was actually the nature of the European regimes, states, the Eastern European ones, sorry. Because the heart of Marxism is that idea of self-emancipation, the idea that ordinary people can transform the world, and at the heart of revolution. And yet, after the war, a whole number of countries, like Poland and Hungary, were declared worker states, except there'd been no revolution there. There hadn't been mass self-activity going on. So how could they be worker states? And it forced people to re-evaluate. And it was what Tony Cliff said, it was through looking at the Eastern European states, he got a clearer vision of what was actually happening in Russia. It wasn't easy, because he describes in his biography I've got here, he couldn't sleep for a month wrestling with these difficult questions, because the implications of saying Russia was not socialist, not progressive, were immense. But really it was from these questions that he started asking that he developed the theory of bureaucratic state capitalism. This is a theory that showed that Russia was not a worker state, not even a degenerated worker state. And this is what I'm going to try and explore in this meeting. But I want to just say very clearly, Cliff always saw himself building on the work of Trotsky. He always saw himself, building on that tradition of Trotsky. But I want to be clear, this meeting is not a history lesson, because we are living at a time of immense economic and political crisis, where capitalism is being questioned by many millions of people, we want to be able to talk about alternatives, don't we? We need to be able to rescue what really happened in 1917 when workers took over the world and the possibilities for something different from the absolutely Stalinist caricature of socialism that is often used against us. And it's not just alternatives, it's how you get there as well when you think about the massive revolutionary processes unfolding, because often it's used, isn't it, by actually the left and right to say revolutions can't work. They always lead to tyranny. That's always how it ends in Stalin. We have to develop a materialist understanding to understand how this situation came about. So let's step back a second, because if we were in this room today to contrast our vision of socialism with the reality of what existed in Russia under Stalin after 1928 and in Eastern European countries, they could not be further apart, really. Like we say, about self-emancipation of millions of people transforming the world, revolution being made, lots of different ideas about a different world. And in that way, we often say there isn't a blueprint for socialism, because it's been made by many more people than are here at Marxism or in this room. But there are some key features that we can draw out. The first thing is, any socialist society would have to be a classless society. There would not be a tiny class exploiting the majority of people. A tiny minority owning all the wealth in society, all the factories, the mines, the land, financial institutions, and at the same time, majority of us owning nothing. We'd have to, instead, things would be collectively owned. As a consequence, if we got rid of class society, those who do all the work would need real control over it, be part of the decision making about how to allocate resources and what to make in society. And these decisions would not be based on whether they make a profit, but whether it fulfills a real human need. And if you're going to have that real control, you need more democracy. Because if you're going to make decisions, the mass of people need to be involved in that. And so rather than just the idea of democracy when you go to the election polls, every 5 years, a much deeper democracy about economic and political issues based in workplaces, communities, universities. And actually the idea that we have the discussion, we make collective decisions and we act on them. Everyone could be involved in that. So on these basis of what I've just said, which is essentially a classless society, workers' control and greater democracy, was Russia socialist? Well, it wasn't a classless society at all. You had a bureaucratic class, very privileged, made decisions about what being produced. It's sometimes argued that because there was no private property in Russia, there was state ownership, that it must have been socialist. The key here, though, is actually about who controls that, the real relations of production. And in Russia, the state owned the means of production. The question is, who owned the state? It wasn't the workers, it was the Stalinist bureaucracy, a very small class at the top of society that made, very privileged actually, and made all the decisions about production, the economy, set targets, and everything else like that. Okay, what about workers' control? They said, the name of Russia was the USSR, the Soviets, and the even name of it, which is bizarre, because the Soviets, which had played in the workers' councils, a massive role in the 1917 revolution, did not exist in any real form. There was no workers' control, in fact the very opposite. The last remnant of workers' control over production was abolished in 1929 and was replaced by one-man management by Stalin. The orders of the one-man manager were to be unconditionally binding on all his subordinate administrative staff and on all workers. Trade unions were stripped of all their functions under Stalin, no role in negotiating wages, strikes were outlawed, you'd be shot or sent to a labour camp. Extremely harsh labour discipline, and if you missed one day off work without a good reason, not only could you lose your job, you might lose your home as well. Forced labour on a massive issue. This is not about workers having any control. And even less democracy than we have here. When elections did take place, there was only ever one candidate, and usually they got 99.9% of the vote. In fact, there was plenty of times when candidates got more than 100% of the vote. Such was the rigging that went on, really. Sometimes the results would be announced even before polling had closed. So it was the idea of any real democracy involving ordinary people is a joke. But really, just because it's not socialist, does that make it capitalist? Because maybe it's a new, different form of class society. Maybe it's got imperfections, but slightly more progressive. So in order to assess this, we have to define capitalism. We have to understand the fundamental features of capitalism. Marx described two main features of the capitalist mode of production. The first is that It's, like we said, a class society, that workers are separated from the means of production. Like we said, a tiny minority, the capitalists own all those things that are needed to produce the things that we need, whether it's land, the factories, everything like that. Most people have no option but to go and work for one or other of them. In this sense, they talk about free labour sometimes. And Marx said workers are free in two senses of the word. They're free from any access to the means of production, because they haven't got it themselves directly, and they're free in that they're free to sell their ability to work to one or other of the capitalists. They're not exactly slaves like that. But the point is, the heart of this relationship is exploitation. When workers go to work, the amount of value we create when we go to work is far more than what we get back in our wages. And the difference between what we're paid and the value we create at work is the source of profit. It's called surplus value, creamed off by the capitalists, kept by them, source of their profits in that way. But there's another division in capitalism, and that's between the capitalists themselves. They may be a tiny minority, but they're all in competition with each other. And this gives rise to this feature of capitalism, which Marx terms the accumulation of surplus value. Okay, so what does this mean really? Because what he's saying is that when an individual capitalist decides whether to invest or go into production, it's the motive force is not actually their own consumption. Although, of course, you know, they like to look after themselves and reward themselves and make sure they've got lots of luxurious goods. But their motive force for making investment decisions is actually, will it lead to more profit? And they'll get more profit to invest in more production. And really, this is what Marx talked about the idea of accumulation for accumulation's sake, production for production's sake. It's not about the idea of the vast extra value being consumed by the capitalists, but it's to go into the productive process to feed further production. And so production isn't about fulfilling need, it takes on a life of its own. And it's competition between the capitalists that leads to this drive to accumulate. Because if there wasn't any competition, any individual capitalist could decide, you've got this extra value that's being created, do I consume it myself? Do I give it back to the workers? Or do I use it to reinvest? Actually, competition means you've got to put it back into investing in better technology, more machinery, because you've got to try and stay one step ahead of your rivals and try and undercut them in that way. No capitalist can relax in that way. They constantly have to reinvest to stay ahead. And that gives rise to what I'm talking about, this dynamic of capitalism, which is called accumulation, investing in further production. Okay, so did Russia have these characteristics? Well, we've already seen workers were separated off from the means of production. They had no control over them. They were owned by the state, the bureaucracy controlled the state. And actually, that control was enforced by massive powers of repression. The harder question comes is, was Russia characterised by this capitalist tendency of accumulation for the sake of accumulation? It brings us to the question of competition, because many people say there can't possibly be capitalism in Russia because there was no individually competing capitalist enterprises or companies. There weren't different firms competing there. And if you just take Russia in isolation from the whole of the rest of the world economy, that is true. There was no competition between the individual enterprises there. The economy as the whole was planned from top down. The state determined the plan. Each individual enterprise was given a specific output target. They were legally binding to meet those targets. All the supplies were centrally allocated. No interaction on an internal market. So production doesn't seem to be driven by competition. But you can't look at Stalinist Russia in abstraction from the rest of the world economy. You have to view it in relations with world capitalism. And here, although there may not be competition within Russia, it was competing on a global scale. It didn't take the form of price competition. That's normally how we see competition in capitalism, each firm trying to undercut each other. It didn't take that form. It took the form of military competition, wanting to ensure that Russia matched, if not bettered, the military might of the Western countries. In the first instance, this was Britain in the late 1920s. It was then with Nazi Germany from 1933 to 45, and then against the US and its allies after the Second World War from 1945 onwards. And so yes, in Russia itself, the economy was planned, but it was planned in order to compete externally in international capitalism. Again, let's just take a slight step back, because there's another popular misconception that planning is unique to socialism. And so If there's no planning, that's capitalism. It's not really true that there's no planning in capitalism though, because on the one hand, we often talk about the anarchy of the market, and it's true, there's no total planning in capitalism. That's why it's so crazy. And we can, the crises that develop and overproduction and such. But actually, within this, each individual capital enterprise, big or small, from a little family firm to a giant multinational, plans in absolute detail. They plan production, what raw materials are we going to need, what other resources, how much labour will we need, what should each worker do, what machinery should we invest in. They make a massive plan, we call it a business plan. And in this way, you could view Russia, if you like one massive factory with a giant elaborate plan, driven forward by the need to compete militarily with the West, with the same dynamic as capitalism, competitive accumulation, driving the system forward. And this is very important because the military competition was not some little sideline that could be separated off from the rest of the economy. It dominated the entire economy, and actually all the economic decisions were made on this basis. It changed the whole priorities of what was produced. All of the economy geared towards arms production. And it's crazy when you look at iron and steel use. In 1932, half of all the iron and steel being used in what were termed the construction machine building plants. They were making factories to build new machines, essentially. Half of it was towards arms production. Factories that were going to make arms. By 1938, this munitions construction accounted for 94% of all the iron and steel that was being consumed in machine building construction, a massive amount. This continues to grow in the post-war period, 1950 to 1965. And twice as large a percentage of national income being spent on armaments as even in the 1930s. And so 2/3 of capital being used directly for armaments. So all their decisions were based on how this compared with the West. Well, the question does come, where on earth did this drive for military competition come from? Because let's be honest, when people made the revolution in 1917, it was definitely not one of the aims, we want more arms, actually it was against the First World War. And one of the first decisions that was made after the October 1917 revolution was to get out of that First World War. And so, where's this come from really? And the clear turning point is in 1928, when the first 5-year plan is introduced by Stalin. It's at this point that consumption is subordinated to accumulation. This is the key feature of capitalism, i.e., rather than trying to improve the living standards of the mass of ordinary people, let's put the investment in heavy industry. But how does that situation arise? Because we're essentially saying, in about 10 years, Russia went from a high point of a workers' revolution, something we celebrate, a glimpse of a different world, a workers' state, to being its opposite, capitalism. And so we need to be able to explain that, otherwise the conclusion is that all revolutions are bound to fail or lead to tyranny. We have to be clear, what happened was not a continuation of the revolutionary process. It was actually a counter-revolution led by Stalin on behalf of the bureaucracy. And actually by 1928, essentially, a new class had taken power. And actually, it wasn't even that Stalin in that consciously set out to do this. Where did this come from? The roots, really, of what happens come in 1924. Shortly after Lenin's death, Stalin declares it's possible to build socialism in one country. This turned everything that Marx and the Bolsheviks had stood for on its head. They stood for internationalism. And in 1924, when Stalin declares the idea of socialism in one country, I don't really think he knew what this was going to lead to, but a different logic develops that comes to the conclusion that we've talked about in 1928 as being the key turning point. Actually, one part of this was a consequence of the massive problems the Russian Revolution faced immediately after the revolution in 1917. And here two key factors interact: the weakness of the Russian working class and the failure of the revolution to spread to other countries and the fact that it was isolated. And actually both the growth of the bureaucracy and Stalin in the 1920s and the idea of socialism in one country are rooted in these material difficulties facing Russia. Because let's just quickly look at this. The Russian economy had been devastated by the First World War, and then immediately after, workers had made the revolution, actually ended up being faced by counter-revolution. 14 different armies from across the world make common cause with the old remnants of the old order and try and overthrow the Soviets, the workers' councils, and attack them. And although the Red Army and the Bolsheviks win the Civil War, the economy is further decimated. And you've got to understand, Russia was a backward country before the First World War. I mean, one thing just shows this really. The average income in Russia in 1913 was only 81% of what it had been in Britain in 1688, 100 years before the Industrial Revolution. That shows how backward it was before the First World War and Civil War. And so there's devastation, economic collapse on an unprecedented level, leading to starvation, disease, claiming the lives of millions of people. Industry is devastated, and actually the working class itself, already quite small in Russia, the size of it is halved as people lose their lives fighting to defend the revolution or have to return to the countryside to find food. Now look, Lenin and the Bolsheviks have been internationalists from the very beginning. They'd always said that yes, Russia is backward. It couldn't sustain itself alone after a revolution. But again, only a problem if you look in Russia in isolation. If you look to other countries, these problems can be overcome. If revolutions took place in Germany or places that are much more advanced industrially than Russia, then the resources, skilled labour, technology, machinery, all would have flowed into Russia to help them industrialise and overcome these weaknesses that are going on. Internationalism was at the heart of the Bolshevik tradition. They were clear, you can't build socialism in one country, especially one as backward as Russia. And to emphasise this, I just want to read Lenin's quote, made well before. He said, "We always staked our play upon an international revolution, and this was unconditionally right. We always emphasised the fact that in one country it is impossible to accomplish such a work as a socialist revolution." And it wasn't a pipe dream. It wasn't that, this was a crazy thing to think. Revolutionary waves swept the world after the Russian Revolution, from Germany to Italy, Hungary, even Britain, a massive upsurge in struggle. The real tragedy was the defeat of the German Revolution. So, and I just want to say as well, when the Bolsheviks didn't sit around either, they would play every role they could to strive internationally to help these revolutions go forward. But by the start of the 1920s, the revolutionary wave had receded, and prospects of revolution elsewhere did look less likely, but we have to be clear, there was the potential still, mass confrontations did go on. But you see, Stalin declares the opposite. He says it's possible to build socialism in one country, and after you start saying that, a very different logic begins to develop. Because by saying you only need socialism in one country, no longer are you striving for the spread of revolution. It's not even desirable to get revolution elsewhere. But also, it comes the question then of, once that's ruled out, how will Russia defend itself? Because we said there's a reality facing Russia, as we know, invaded by the imperialist powers after the revolution. And in 1927, there's an increase in international tension. Actually, Britain broke off relations with the USSR. They were scared there was going to be a war in Moscow. What would they do? And the only way, if you're going to isolate yourself in that way, as Stalin was saying, is you have to become a great power like the others. Actually, you have to get the military equipment to match the other major capitalist states. And if you're going to get that, it depends on the existence of a heavy industrial base capable of mass producing modern weapons systems. The logic then is you have to develop the economy and industrialise. You're going to have to catch up with the West in order to compete militarily. And it's going to have to do it on its own, because the West is not going to, give you any loans or anything to help import their technology. And so Stalin's regime, bear in mind what I said about it being incredibly backwards, it responded to this need for military competition by industrialising Russia at an absolutely breakneck speed. And Stalin was very clear about this. He said, to slacken the tempo would mean falling behind, and those who fall behind get beaten. But we do not want to get beaten. We refuse to be beaten. We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We have to make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it or go under. He's clear. We're very, very behind. We have to catch up in 10 years. That means massive industrialisation. Completely changes the whole priorities of the system. And the turning point, as I said, is 1928 and the first 5-year plan. And this is very clear even from the figures, because even during the 1920s, up until 1928, even when the economic situation was quite bad, 2/3 of the Russian economy actually was devoted to consumer goods. the things that people would need to try and improve their living standards, education, agriculture, food, those sorts of things. This immediately changes after 1928. 2/3 of the economy is now devoted to producer goods, capital accumulation. Massive increase in the investment in industry. And so that characteristic symptom of capitalism I've talked about, the domination of society by capital accumulation, is clearly there. And actually, by doing this, they do pretty much succeed in what they set out to do, catch up with the West. Russia does become an industrial giant. By the 1950s, the USSR was the second largest industrial economy in the world. But to do it, the price paid in terms of human misery on a massive scale is almost impossible to estimate, because to industrialise at such a rapid rate meant a massive increase in the exploitation of Russian workers and peasants, to squeeze as much of that surplus value out of them to plough back into production. So we see the forced collectivisation that goes on from 1929. Peasants forced into the big collective farms. If, on a mass scale, if you resisted, you were sent to slave labour camps. It's estimated 1 million peasant households were deported. So all the millions of us forced to do this. And, you know, absolutely unbelievable. I was just reading some of the quotes. The hours of work, it's like going back to Tsarist times when, you know, if you worked on one of these farms, you had to get up at 4 a.m. and go to bed at 10 p.m. I mean, you know, massive amounts of labour being used. And forcing the peasants, peasantry off the land into the cities to provide the workforce for the new factories. A massive amount of urbanisation happening at this time. And it also, collectivisation means the state can control the grain production. And really what you're talking about is the collectivisation of the peasantry brought about the similar results that had happened in Britain when the capitalists and bourgeoisie forced peasants from their land through the enclosures and land clearances. And Marx, when he talked about that process, he talked about history being written in fire and blood, just talking about how brutal that process was. But actually, this was even more extreme in Russia. I mean, Tony Cliff, when he was analysing it, said Stalin did it in a few hundred days, what it had taken Britain a few hundred years to do in terms of clearing people from the land. And of course, massive industrialisation and exploitation of the working class. And based on some of the figures, you see, actually up until 1928, real wages have gone up somewhat, and working hours have been cut. This immediately changes. Now real wages are cut by 50%, the productivity of labour in the first 5-year plan is trebled to get more and more out of workers. And if you're going to do that, then you have to develop a privileged layer of people to administer the regime and a police state essentially to crush all the opposition. So this other feature that we associate very much with Stalinism grows out of it, the systematic coercion of ordinary people through the secret police, repressive labour laws, the labour camps, all those things that we talked about. And so sometimes, like I said, sometimes this massive shift and changes in the whole priorities of the system that takes place after 1928, sometimes they're termed another phase of the revolution that started in 1917. This is termed Stalin's revolution. We have to be clear, this was a counter-revolution. It marks the point at which this growing bureaucracy transforms itself into a ruling class, with exploiting the massively enlarged working class that they create and subject to always competitive pressures. It meant that any remnants from 1917 of a worker state, no matter how distorted and degenerated, any remnants that had made it through were absolutely taken away by 1928 and gone, and state capitalism was now installed. Sometimes people argue, well, could it really have been a counter-revolution? You know, did that happen? Actually, the bureaucracy already through the 1920s and growing its power did control industry, the police and the army. It didn't need to wrest control of them like workers had to do in 1917. But what it did have to do was purge the Bolshevik party and the party there of all the people that remembered the revolution of 1917. And this is what you see really in the show trials and the terror of the 1930s. Absolutely the murder of all those people who remembered real revolutionary tradition. I mean, apparently by 1939, there was 1.5 million party members in Russia. Only 1.3% of those had been in the party during the 1917 revolution. This was not due to natural causes, because most of those who made the revolution were really young. It was because they had been systematically murdered. And, you know, on a massive, massive scale, including Trotsky, you know, and all the leaders of the revolution. But as I say, not just the leaders, anyone involved in that real tradition of workers taking power. And so, Tony Cliff actually describes the 1930s and the terror and the trials that did. He describes it as a civil war of the bureaucracy against the masses, a civil war in which only one side was armed and organised. So, to conclude, the assertion, really, that Russia was socialist was one of the greatest lies of the last century. It was put forward by both the Western capitalists and the Stalinists, and resonates still today. It was such a big lie. We're dealing with it today. That is why the clarity of Tony Cliff's theory of state capitalism is so important, because he didn't just base it on moralistic idea that Stalinism was brutal and bad. He located it by understanding the real economic the dynamics of the Russian economy. Because other people, grappled with these ideas. He wasn't the first person, but actually he understood, it located Russia within an international context, dominated by military competition, that then fueled the dynamic of that economy. And it meant it didn't have to give an inch to the idea that somehow Russia and Eastern Europe was somehow progressive. Both were versions of capitalism, driven by competition, based on exploitation of the vast mass of people and brutal class societies. And that's why it allowed the International Socialists and the SWP to navigate the Cold War period. But there's also something else to say here, because at the end of state capitalism, which people might want to read and we can discuss these things more, which Tony Cliff wrote in 1948, the final chapter he ends by saying, well, he actually says, the final chapter of what's happened in Russia will be written by the masses. Because Marx is clear that capitalism creates its own gravediggers. The more it expands, it creates a workforce, a working class with potential power to overturn it. Definitely the case in Russia. The breakneck industrialisation I've described created a massive working class. And by understanding that it was a state capitalist regime, it was possible to understand that class nature of the system, and the class struggles would break out as workers at certain points will fight back. I mean, throughout the post-war period, there were uprisings in Eastern Europe, 1956 Hungary, 1968 Czechoslovakia, many others as well actually, and then came the actual fall of those regimes in 1989. To be honest, if those countries, Russia and Eastern European, had been workers' states, no matter how degenerated, then workers would have defended their state. It was not the case in 1989. Not only did workers not defend their state, they were active in rising against it. And so for Tony Cliff, who had asked that question in 1948 about Eastern Europe, how could regimes imposed by tanks, where no revolutions had taken place, how can they possibly be worker states? The events of 1989 proved that theory. And actually, the theory of state capitalism allowed us not to be demoralised like so much of the left were after 1989. We could celebrate, alongside millions of people, the end of fake socialism. We also had to understand, as Chris Harman described it, what happened in 1989 was a sidestep from one form of capitalism to another, from bureaucratic state capitalism to multinational free market capitalism. Essentially, that's why much of the bureaucracy that has formed that tiny class in Russia's society, at the top of the Eastern European ones, were able to become the chief executives of locally owned firms or multinationals. Essentially, they stayed in place, really. The same personnel were at the top of societies. But the end of fake socialism was a cause for celebration, because it opened up the possibility for the real rediscovery of the real revolutionary ideas of Lenin, Trotsky, and the true legacy of the October Revolution. And like I said, obviously we have to know our history. It's very important. That's why we have meetings like this. But they're not just history lessons, and we're not just, we're commentators and we can sit here and go, oh, isn't it great? We were right. It's all fine now. We were proved right and be very smug about it. It's not about that. It's about how do we further the struggle today as well. And state capitalism was a crucial ideological tool to be able to get through that post-war period, understand what was going on, and orientate ourselves. But at its heart, why it was there was a reassertion of the idea of Marxism, the self-emancipation of ordinary people. Stalinism has absolutely stunted the vision of socialism and the idea, the true emancipatory network, idea of transforming the world to a very different, brilliant, different vision of society. It stunted that, and it takes away that idea that ordinary people can transform the world. And this was an ideological tool that we don't have to deal with those states existing, but we constantly can refer to and use to understand what happened and to help further struggle today and take it forward.
this is a question. There's quite a famous Chomsky, bit of Chomsky footage on YouTube, which most of you probably seen, where Chomsky criticises Leninism as also being an example of state capitalism. And he makes the point that one of the first things Lenin did was to dissolve the Soviets and therefore remove the worker control of the means of production, and to institute a fairly virulent strain of vanguardism, so there was no democratic accountability of the party. And of course, after the Civil War, he instituted the new economic policy. So the same sort of criticisms you make of Stalin, Chomsky makes of Lenin, and I just wondered what your views are on that. Thank you.
Hello. The thing is, though, as I understand it, this state capitalist theory, regardless of its accuracy, really doesn't help you against the naysayers. Does it really matter if socialism fell in the 1920s or fell in 1989? Either way, socialism failed. You know, in a sense that socialism is responsible for this state capitalist situation because it only came about because of socialism. If there had been no socialist revolution in Russia, there would have been no state capitalist Stalin and any of that militarist, and it wouldn't have happened. It's the consequences, you know. So it's not really going to get you out of any trouble, because it doesn't matter. In a sense, I can't say, well, socialism failed or socialism failed. It doesn't matter if socialism failed in 1989. I mean, not at the level of what does socialism mean, but at the level of it doesn't help you against the naysayers to simply say that the Soviet Union was state capitalist, because either way it's failed.
Yeah, I'm going to reply to that and say that just because the argument that socialism fails, the naysayers, it's completely useless. Trying to be a revolutionary, completely useless. Trying to change the world because it was always failed. It does matter. It matters a lot today. Hugely matters. This question: was the Soviet Union state capitalist or was it socialist? And why did it become state capitalist? If we believe it to be state capitalist, that matters a lot. And I'm also going to talk about, I think for me, when I was going over these ideas, when I became a revolutionary two years ago, trying to fight the Tories, the key idea was about the international part of the revolution in 1917 up to 1923, and particularly Germany, but not just Germany. If you think about the revolutions around the world in the 1920s, you've got China, you've got a revolutionary struggle in Brazil, you have a revolutionary struggle or potential in Britain in 1919, very close to a revolution. In where I come from, Norfolk, the agricultural workers practically ground the county down and took control almost. The Tories panicked massively with open, blatant class struggle. But unfortunately, these struggles were not successful. And because they were not successful, Russia became isolated. And as Amy has pointed out, if a country is isolated in a sea of capitalism, that is going to have a lot of effects. And that has an effect on the economy. And in terms of the evidence for state capitalism for the Soviet Union, I think there's a huge amount of evidence. One example, I studied the Soviet Union before becoming a revolutionary, and I believed in Trotsky's ideas because they made the most sense of what happened. I was convinced by the evidence of what happened in the Soviet Union that it was actually capitalist, because if you just look at the Soviet Union, maybe you could argue it's not capitalist because there's no competition within the Soviet Union and it doesn't have any links on the market. But unfortunately, when you look at the overall world economy, the Soviet Union did have links with the market, did have links with the capitalist market. For example, they had to sell grain on the capitalist market in order to get the industrial expertise and high quality metals to make the first industrial leaps forward. And the Soviet leaders, right up until Gorbachev, were obsessed with the productivity, particularly of the products that they sold on the world market, in order to get the money to keep their economy, the goods in order to keep their economy going, in order to get the technical needs. So that is one piece of evidence for the theory of state capitalism, is very open, important piece of evidence, which is that they had to sell onto the world market in order to get goods and technology, in order to industrialise, in order to craft. And in order to get that grain, they had to actually do what Amy's talked about, which is, in the West, we smashed the peasantry. Enclosure wasn't a nice thing, it was a brutal thing, but it took hundreds of years. We also enslaved huge population of Africa in order to use the New World, in order to kickstart capitalism. The Soviet Union, the Soviet bureaucracy did the same, it's just that they did it in 10 years. And that makes it more barbaric. So I think it does matter hugely. And looking at the revolutionary struggle in the 1920s is very important, particularly in Germany. And why that wasn't successful is hugely important in answering this question. And it's hugely important now. It's relevant now because we're in another revolutionary struggle. We have to put forward the idea that there is a possibility that workers can take control and actually propose and begin to make a new kind of society. And if that's not possible, then we are really, really stuck. So it does matter, and I'm just going to raise that as a kind of question to everyone, that it does matter.
Thanks. I think for myself personally, it's quite an important question about, say, capitalism, seeing as I come from the former Czechoslovakia. And I remember a few weeks ago, an insurance company phoned up my mum, and they asked her, would you like some insurance for your washing machine? And she said, well, look, I've already got, 10-year warranty, whatever. I said, but this is a 5-year plan. So, no thanks, I've already had enough of those back at home. But I think what's really important when looking at, let's say, the Eastern European states and actually sort of the Soviet Union as well, is this idea of the bureaucracy and why it's actually similar to capitalism. And obviously the bureaucracy was just there as a means to accumulate more and more capital at the expense of the workers. But the really key thing about capitalism is that there's a tendency for the rate of profit to fall, because the more capital there is in relation to profit, surplus value, which comes from workers, the rate of profit falls. And you can see with the 5-year plans, with every 5-year plan it goes down and down and down, so you can see that process already starting. And actually, if you look at sort of the so-called reform movements, sort of like Dubček in the sort of 1968 Prague Spring, even that actually came about. I still have a sort of mild respect for the man, but that actually came about because of that crisis. They needed to reinvent, sort of replan the economy in order to try and get rid of that, sort of try and circumvent that tendency rate of profit to fall. And obviously, just with the elections, I remember Cliff used to give this anecdote, which was that sometimes they got, this one candidate got 150% of the votes, and the official explanation was that the voters from the neighbouring district were so enthused by the candidate they came and voted in the other district. But I think this is all very fine and so abstract and it's important, but why is it important to our tradition? And really that's, if you look at Hal Draper's The Two Souls of Socialism, and he talks about socialism from above and socialism from below. And if you look at social democracy, reformism, and you look at Stalinism, it's from above. We'll get elected, and we'll just take control of the state and do it on behalf of workers, that sort of thing. And real Marxist tradition is socialism from below, which is actually workers take control, take power over the means of production, and that's where they sort of take it. But I just want to comment briefly on 1989 actually, and it was a sidestep because social relations didn't change. And it's true, I mean, I know a fair few sort of managers who used to be managers in the old Stalinist system, but what Trotsky talked about and where Trotsky sort of went wrong was where he said all this needed is a political revolution in the Soviet Union and in the Eastern Bloc, and what really was needed was a social revolution, where actually social relations were transformed. And that actually was, I think, where you can see the need for a revolutionary party. I mean, you had some Trotskyists, let's say in Czechoslovakia, Petr Uhl, for example, and he didn't really understand the nature of the Czechoslovak state. And he was saying, well, actually, perhaps we can use this state, sort of reformism. But what really came up why the 1989 revolution didn't succeed in any sort of working class sense, even though there was that potential there. If you remember, they were strikes. That's what actually brought this, bureaucracy down. Actually, was when workers went on strike. But the real argument is that only one side is organised, and that's really the key thing. And I think also your question about Chomsky here. I mean, sort of he defines himself as a libertarian socialist, and he comes in with, say, anarcho-syndicalism and sort of the left Marxists, he calls it, say Rosa Luxemburg came in, and that's his tradition. And I think this is really an argument over spontaneity and sort of class consciousness, and sort of vanguardism and why we need a revolutionary party, because obviously revolutions, like, you know, they don't just happen spontaneously, even though something like the student uprising of 2010, there can be that sudden upsurge. But because, you know, ideas come from the inherent to where we are, you know, sexism, racism, it comes out of a capitalist society. So you need those sort of the best class fighters, the best workers organised in a revolutionary party so they can actually, you know, take that struggle forward, make that argument, where can we go forward. So, you know, that's why then we need a revolutionary party. So obviously the theory of state capitalism is important to us because it shows, it can tell us why our analysis is correct, it informs our tradition that we're from, and actually it can inform how we can take the struggle forward today in Britain, how we can take that forward, linking up students and workers, and obviously if anyone isn't a member, I would really urge you to join. Cheers.
It's important not just to be able to say that Russia wasn't socialist, but actually to be able to understand why that was so and why it came about. And I think that's what the first state capitalism really enabled us to do. It's not just to say that Russia isn't socialist because bad people got in and took over and changed it, but actually that was a consequence of the world situation at the time, that it was because Russia was locked into this competition with the Western Bloc as well that forced these things to happen, that it was due to the international nature of the revolution that Conrad talked about earlier, because that didn't happen, that this was a consequence of those things. And the meetings later on in this course will look at what happened in the same period in the Western world and in what was called the Global South at the time as well, which followed on from the theory of state capitalism. Without an understanding of state capitalism, we wouldn't have been able to understand the long boom in the Western world or the nature of what was going on across the rest of the place as well. And I think what that then enables us to do is, as Amy outlined really, is hold on to the true nature of what happened in the Russian Revolution, the glimpse of, you know, a different society that was there. And I can't remember exactly who said it, it might have been Tony Cliff, who talks about how, yes, the Russian Revolution did lead to this horrible Stalinist regime, but within it there was also the germ of other societies, and you don't know what's going to grow once you plant that germ. You could have ended up in a much better world, and that's, you know, those things are things that we need to hold on to that happened in the Russian Revolution.
I'm a German comrade. My question is the following. Plekhanov, one of those Mensheviks, the father of Russian Marxism, warned the Russian communists about the possibility of a development of state capitalism instead of socialism if power is taken too early, basically. He said that if in 1917 or so workers are only a tiny minority of maybe 1 or 2% of the whole population of Russia, it would be very hard to establish socialism in the Marxist sense or something. So he said, we, as communists, we would have to wait until the working class would make up more than 30% or whatever, I don't know, so much more than 1% of the population in order to establish socialism. But so maybe one would think his theory was right, and Bolsheviks would have needed to wait until this point is reached. But I think Lenin and Trotsky were right in saying that you can start doing a revolution in one country, also if there's only 1% of working class, by building an alliance with the rest of oppressed classes, maybe like peasants or so. So it was a start, I think. It was a very hard start. And in 1917, I guess, if the working class would have not started this revolution, I guess they would have been crushed, and the labor movement would have been crushed, and it would, the outcome would have not been a democratic state or something like that, but also some kind of state capitalism. Only not led by the Bolsheviks later or Stalinists, but instead of them by the Mensheviks or something like that. Who knows? I think the major point about this question is that how to say, I would say the major point is that in Russia the revolution started, but it was needed that in Germany also the revolution would go on, but it was crushed by the socialist, by those social democratic leaders and so on. They betrayed the working class, they betrayed the communists, killed Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, and so I would say we have to analyze this situation and see what can happen in the future also. Maybe we will have also similar situations where we have to try taking over power, but in very, very hard situations. Maybe who knows, in some Arab countries in the future there will happen something like that, or who knows, in China maybe, or somewhere else. And how will we react then? This is the question I would say. Thank you.
I think it's a bit misleading to say that the socialist revolution of 1917 caused state capitalism, because if you look at the Tsarist regime in Russia, it was a heavily autocratic and bureaucratic regime in itself. Like, for example, in 1881, Alexander II had the safeguard system, which had the very tyrannical policing systems, which really sort of where Stalin sort of built upon. And I also think that if, like, the revolution did come when the time wasn't right, because when Marx wrote about Western countries' capitalism and criticised industrial capitalism in a state which I don't think Russia had actually reached in 1917. I think the 1917 Russian Revolution wasn't so much a result of class struggle as due to the great strain on the Tsarist state due to the war, which was leading to mass starvation across all classes rather than just the working class rising up. And also, I think, like in 1905, where they nearly had a revolution but didn't, and then they expanded press freedom, this like sort of liberty. Russia wasn't really like the countries Marx was criticising the capitalism of. It wasn't at the state of it. So I think that even a Tsarist regime would probably develop quite a bureaucratic approach, and I think if Russia industrialised in the 20th century, I don't think that a Tsarist regime then, they would have probably developed in a similar tyrannical and brutal fashion to state capitalism. So I don't think that the socialist revolution caused state capitalism. I think that would have been Russia's sort of natural result due to its industrial backwardness.
Just a quick thing, just on the whole idea of how you form your thoughts, and one of the major ways that people analyse Russia today was through Trotsky and his analysis of it. And it's just a few quick points I want to go through that I think Trotsky kind of, when he analysed it on the basis of a deformed worker state, I think his platform for analysing it was kind of wrong, looking back on it now, because what he argued was, in order to come to the deformed worker state, was first of all that capitalism would never get through the crisis of the 1930s, and in fact that wasn't true. They actually came out of it, capitalism came out of the 1930s stronger than ever. And I mean, the second thing was the fact that, yes, he said Russia at the time was a deformed worker state, and what he said was either the domestic working class would rise up and destroy the state bureaucracy that had formed, or that the working class throughout the world would rise up and therefore Stalinist bureaucracy would just melt away. Of course we know that's not true, because the workers didn't rise up for a very long time, and capitalism continued to grow through the West, you know. And the third thing was that capitalism was in such a crisis that it would never be able to give concessions. And of course, after the war, a huge welfare state boomed for the last 30-40 years. So therefore, I think when you're analysing the state of Russia and using Trotsky and his analysis, you have to understand that where he was situated at the time and where we are now, it doesn't really add up, because obviously capitalism had grown throughout the last couple of decades. But I'm really happy that you brought up the turning point for Stalin when he said that you could build socialism in one country, because the whole idea of Marxist analysis, and I do take the point, I do think that up to 1915 he was a Marxist. Stalin was, in his own mind, a Marxist. And when he took that position, he abandoned all Marxist thought, because Marxism was based, and I know Karl Marx himself said, if this is Marxism, I'm not Marxist, but Karl Marx had said the self-emancipation is what's at the heart, and workers' control is what is at the heart of socialism. And if you look at the Stalinist bureaucracy, workers didn't have control. They didn't even have freedom, even to the Western standard. But just one quick thing, just on what you were saying about is it important to analyse it? Of course it's important to analyse it, because it helps us understand what actually happened and how to prevent it in the future. And just a quick quote from Gramsci, I think he said back in the early 20th century, it was easier because of the ideology. It was easier to start a revolution, but because it was atomised, it was harder to sustain. But now, because everything is industrialised, because capitalism is in every corner of the earth, it is harder to instigate, it is harder to start, but it is easier to sustain, and we will sustain. A revolutionary tide has started. The question is whether we take the example of the original ideology of the Russian Revolution and apply it today, because it's still relevant. So if you're not active, please do get active.
My name is Sasha, I'm from Ukraine. I grew up in the Soviet Union. So I'll be very upfront, as we often Slavs are. So I thought I'm in the wrong talk. I thought that it's kind of like a right-wing party gathering. Because, okay, I'll start with the facts, because my talk will be very attacking. Okay, facts. So you said that the flat could be taken away if a worker missed one day of work. So after Stalin, that wasn't the case. You said that workers raised against the Soviet regime, and you said 1999. So the whole talk is about Eastern Europe rather than Soviet Union. And as I understand, the evidence from the Eastern Europe. But you keep talking about Stalinism and about Soviet Union, so there's a big confusion here, because Eastern Europe is the result of the arrangements in Yalta. So in Eastern Europe it's true, there were risings. In Soviet Union, I challenge you to tell me which risings were against the Soviet power, apart from Baltic republics. Yeah, in Vilnius there was. About bureaucratic class. So you describe it as kind of bureaucratic class that kind of ruled the Soviet Union. So my uncle was a high-ranking official in the ministry. He was from a simple family, and I know what privileges he had. Yeah, it was more than others had, but it wasn't a huge privilege that can be compared to what oligarchs have now, or what you have under the capitalist system. So I think it's grossly exaggerated. And also, it wasn't a class, you couldn't inherit it. If you look at the people who raised to the top of the Soviet bureaucratic class, they were usually from very humble background. So it was a system that anyone can rise through, and yeah, it was very strict and oppressive, but you couldn't say that it's one class was oppressing the other. So this is about factual. So second point I want to make is that socialism did work. So the whole argument sounds to me kind of defensive, because in my opinion in the West, that what's the alternative to capitalism is socialism, which didn't work. That's very baffling if you go back to now former Soviet countries, and talk to the left from the East, like myself and people around me. This is very baffling, because to us it did work. There were issues, of course, very complicated issues to discuss and resolve, but overall, to us, it was a counter-revolution in 1991 when bourgeoisie took power back. I like the point. One of the commentators had a good point about bureaucratic, the harsh, the rigid bureaucratic structures in the Soviet Union inherited from Tsarist Russia, and this is a very good point. And this is touches on a more general point I'd like to make. How would you arrange in a multi-million society a socialist state? To me, it's a very challenging theoretical question. It's all well with Soviets, but how would you run a big industrial enterprise and also linked in a complicated economic ties without centralization, without order of command? So to conclude, overall, I think it's much more optimistic for the left, my arguments, than what I hear here, what I heard today, because here it's very defensive and it's very unrealistic to me. I think left movement should open up this debate and discuss what happened in the Soviet Union in all its complexity. It's very complex, a huge debate in Russia now about what happened, and this, I think this will be much more useful and will help for the left to move forward. Thank you.
I do disagree with the last comrade. I think it's true that, for example, after Stalin's death there was a degree of relaxation of the terror, but the simple truth is, for me, it's very simple. Socialism is about workers running society, and at no point under the Stalinist or post-Stalinist regime were workers running the supposed worker state, and therefore it wasn't socialist.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, that's simply the reality. I do want to just return to when the revolution degenerated. I have immense respect for Chomsky as a fighter against imperialism. I do think he's wrong about the problem he identifies with Lenin dissolving the Soviets and so on, because I think the danger is that you see everything that happened in the Soviet Union, rise of Stalinism, simply down to the will of the Bolsheviks. Actually, you have to look at the totality of the historical circumstances and give each their due weight. And the truth is, the Soviets did begin to disintegrate in 1918, 1919, not because the Bolsheviks ordered it, but because the working class disintegrated. The combination of 18 imperialist armies, a blockade on the whole of the Soviet, you couldn't get a letter in, the weak economic basis, the revolution, the civil war, and all the rest of it, had a devastating impact on the economy. I mean, you think about what's happening in Greece now, which is devastating, 20-30% fall in living standards. We're talking 70, 80, 90% economic collapse, right? Arthur Ransom, who wrote Swallows and Amazons, was the Manchester Guardian correspondent and wrote a very good book. He went to Russia, 6 months in Red Russia. He talks about cannibalism returning in Russia. I mean, the centre of Moscow was full of pigeons. People ate them because they were starving, right? You cannot have a workers' democracy surviving in that scale of economic collapse. Most workers went to fight on the front, and those that didn't left the factories and went back to get food. And Soviet democracy can't survive without its class agent, the working class, which disintegrated in those circumstances. And the Bolsheviks really formed a layer of people trying to hold on until the International Revolution arrived. It was a besieged fortress trying to hold on to the International Revolution. Were they mad? There was a revolution in Austria-Hungary, in Germany, there were Soviets in Bavaria, in Hungary, the Italian workers occupied their factories. In the end, and where would the resources come for a non-authoritarian industrialisation of Russia? They would come from German workers, the most advanced country in Europe at the time. That didn't happen because there were not revolutionary parties rooted like the Bolsheviks. It was not Bolshevism that led to Leninism. The truth is, it was its lack of Bolshevism in the West European working class. And that's the truth. Now, these are past events. The point is, there were other possibilities. There were other possibilities. And we can't alter the past, but when it comes to the future, we are entering a new wave of revolutions. The point is to learn those lessons, which is you have to build a revolutionary party, not just in one country, but in many countries, in advance of the revolutions, to make sure that this time the outcome is different.
I think I've got about 5 minutes, and there's a lot in that discussion, so probably this discussion continue, but thanks everyone who brought it up. And actually it's quite interesting, because up until you spoke there, I was going to start this sum up by saying, isn't it interesting how no one defended what happened? That most of us have agreed that that wasn't really our vision of socialism. Obviously the debates rage on, and that's the hold of what's gone on. Let's be clear, I'm not defensive. I'd actually be very defensive here if I was trying to justify to people going into action today, occupiers, those on strike, those fighting against austerity, that their vision was Stalinist Russia or the Eastern European regimes. And of course, there are nuances here. I'm not trying to put everything together, but I feel quite defensive. That's my vision of socialism. And I think we have to go back to what someone else said. We want to have a different world that we're talking about. And by that, we talk about a classless society. There was definitely a class, and this is not just based on a moral view of it. How do we understand the dynamic driving forward these economies? To be able to do what happened was based on exploitation. Exploitation, you squeeze more out of people to get more at the top of it. It controlled all the means of production, people at the top of society, to pile back in the further production so they could compete on a militarily level globally. And that's at the heart of it, and things flow from this. It means if you're going to exploit people, workers don't tend to like it. The peasants didn't really like being collectivised. You have to have coercion, you have to have repression, and this is what went with it. You have to get rid of any sense of workers' control to be able to force those through. And to me, to understand what really happened in those is not about being defensive, it's trying to have an understanding of what goes on in the world so we can actually rescue what socialism or workers' power would look like. Now look, actually the key question that came out to me was that, okay, we might say that's not socialism, but was it even right to play with revolution in the first place? Because this is actually the right-wing often view, there's people who blame Lenin for, never mind for Stalinism, but for the whole Second World War, Nazism, Pol Pot, everything, the crimes of last century are all laid at Lenin's door, because really how dare they mess with the idea of revolution? Let's be honest, it wasn't the case that Bolsheviks and Lenin sat down one day and said, you know what, let's have a revolution. There was a massive social crisis going on in Russia. Absolutely, the whole society was drawn into. Whether it was the First World War, the death at the front, the revolt that went on, what this person described about Tsarism, the question of peasants on the land, and that's why this crisis erupts, class battles erupt, and actually people are forced to take a stand. And you're forced to, actually, because in those, one side wins. And during the 1917, actually, it was perfectly possible that the old Tsarist regime could have won, and if they had, would have sought to reimpose their power even more. That's why they were attempting to have a coup. So what do you do in that situation? How do you take that forward? And absolutely, if you only look at it in the context of Russia alone, and very backward, how could they have thought about making a revolution? They're far too backward, they couldn't sustain it. But that's why we're internationalists. That's why the fact was that they didn't just look at Russia, they looked at actually the tremendous industrialisation of places like Germany, and how this would actually, if revolutions took place, support that revolution and allow it to go forward and sustain it. The real problem, if people have said, is that you have... Oh, I just wanted to say something actually, because it was a direct question at the start, I won't forget it, about Lenin then and what do they do, because they face immediate problems after the revolution. And people who've made it. As I say, massive counter-revolution. The old ruling class don't just sit back and go, great, workers are running society, we'll go. And the rest of the world, capitalism, are like, oh my God, we can't have workers running a society, a vision for everybody else. Everyone else might uprise. That's why they go and invade. What do you do? Let's be really clear here, because I think you asked it. Lenin didn't dissolve the Soviets. Actually, it was about the Constituent Assembly. Now, the Constituent Assembly, if you like, is the equivalent to Parliament. The Soviets, where there's political decisions, it had been a demand, actually. After the revolution, the Soviets are where economic and political decisions are being made. The Constituent Assembly becomes a demand for the right wing, for the counter-revolutionaries, for the White Army, because they think, let's have power there, and then it's not the Soviets anymore, it's not workers directly. And so that's why, in a battle, which it was, does the revolution continue, do we build a workers' state, or do we allow people to smash us, you have to take a side. And they were rallying around that, and that's why there was the arguments for the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly, not of the Soviets, let's be very clear here. Because actually, one of the problems that people have said is the absolute decimation of the working class. About 5% of the population were workers in Russia at the time of the revolution, massively concentrated into gigantic workplaces. That's why they had such power, actually, even though there was a small proportion, they were very concentrated. Actually, their decimation means that the organs of workers' democracy, if you like the Soviets, where people made decisions, well, if you haven't got any workers, how can you have workers' councils? Those people, the decimation of industry means actually those very organs of democracy start to be eroded massively, and a massive vacuum created as workers go back to the countryside, as I said, or literally killed fighting for the revolution, and the working class is halved. Actually, this is what the process that allows the bureaucracy to develop, because the bureaucracy had started just meant doing functional jobs, really, tied into the democracy, accountable to the workers' councils. they begin to take on a life of their own. Actually, Lenin recognises this as a problem very early on. He feels that there's a real problem of growing bureaucratisation, and he's honest about it. He talks about in 1920 to 21, we have a worker state with bureaucratic deformations. And because he based himself on the masses and self-emancipation, he was like, what should we do? How do we create trade unions independent of the state? That's what he was trying to do. He fought a massive battle actually against the bureaucratic regime led by Stalin, against what was going on in that way. But you see, what was the real problem? The failure of the revolution to spread. And I think we have to be clear. The father of Stalin was not Lenin. It was the people that murdered the revolutionaries in Germany and ensured that revolution did not succeed. Because without that revolution, actually, then Russia becomes isolated. Let's be clear though, there were revolutionary potentials still going on. It wasn't all doom and gloom, what can we do? We have to just build socialism in one country, as Stalin said. But absolutely, this sets back the prospect of international revolution massively. And so we have to be clear that the origins then come in dealing with it with this idea of socialism in one country, the absolute anathema to anyone who based himself on Marx and that tradition that people have brought out very, very clearly. And of course there are many debates here and people may feel that not all their questions are answered, and hopefully people are going to go away from this and read some of the books and writings. I just want to say one thing before I sum up, because you see, whenever I read any of the things by Tony Cliff or heard his speeches, he was always clear and paying homage, if you like, or recognising the role Trotsky played. Because he was the person that had led that fight against Stalin. He opposed, throughout the 1920s and 30s, the idea of socialism in one country. He paid for his life with it. Trotsky was murdered because of how he stood out against Stalin. Because he got some things wrong, we don't throw out that whole tradition. What Tony Cliff was doing was building on that tradition and rescuing the real spirit. To us now, there is a question, isn't there? Because if we want to rescue that real spirit, we're going into, like in Stalinist Russia, a massive crisis. Class battles will be happening. Whether or not we determine them or not, there is a massive battle against austerity raging. And this is going to continue, not just in this country, across the world. Actually, how are we going to ensure that these battles go forward, as people have said, or go back? This is the question we grapple with. It won't be about whether we decide revolution is good or bad. They'll be foisted on us. These questions will be foisted on us to make decisions as revolutions about how we act and how we operate in that way. And that's why I would really put forward that within that, we have to be able to present a real alternative view of the world, but a way of doing it and getting there as well, because there's a massive millions of people questioning capitalism. And there is lots of alternatives on offer. Can we give an offer that workers, ordinary people can run society? I think we got a glimpse of it in 1917, not the distortion, but we also have to say, how do we get there? How do we get revolutionary change? Actually, revolutions do spark spontaneously. People go into battles, whatever their ideas to begin with. They don't end spontaneously. They don't end. They end because there'll be absolute classes determine the strategy that goes on, and we have to come out actually of Marxism stronger to take that on, and that's what this meeting's about. It's not saying it's all solved by joining the SWP, but it is saying we have a strong revolutionary party rooted into traditions that Tony Cliff and people thought of. We were a better place to help shape and pull them forward. So I would hope people will start this debate, continue it, but hopefully join us as well and continue those discussions within other meetings here at Marxism.